Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Simon Bonney. I'm a Managing Director at Quantuma, and the day job is Restructuring Specialist and Licensed Insolvency Practitioner. As the country enters another lockdown, we're kickstarting a new series of webinars under our recently launched programme of Building Financial Fortitude. Today's webinar will see us taking a closer look at the hospitality and leisure industry. Our discussion will cover the challenges facing the sector, consider the various government support schemes that have been introduced, and offer some practical steps for businesses to take when planning for the future. Needless to say, it's been a year like no other, and this sector, like many others across the UK and beyond, has been buffeted by an extraordinary set of challenges. Businesses have been and will need to continue to be resilient and proactive in their approach in order to get through this, and our new series of webinars aimed at advisors and businesses alike will help you do just this. The Q&A function is open on the webinar, so please do feel free to submit your questions in real time. Some of you all have already submitted questions, and we'll try and our best to answer those at the end. Before we kick off, I'm contractually obliged to ask for your patience if we do experience any technical difficulties at all during the next hour or so. If we do, it's probably at my end. Some of you will recall that towards the middle of summer, we held a webinar about the sector as we were easing out of lockdown. And I'm delighted to be joined again today by industry expert Shepard to continue the conversation from the perspective of entering a new lockdown. Philip is a board member and advisor to numerous businesses in the hospitality and leisure sector, having formerly been a partner at a Big Four accounting firm, who we won't name, where he led the hotels, leisure and attractions practice in the UK and Middle East. Philip's impressive portfolio includes being on the board of Chichester Festival Theatre and Culture 24. He's the chairman of International Event Management and advisor to Headley Capital, as well as Sterling Hospitality, which manage a portfolio of hotels across the Middle East and Central Europe. He's also a board advisor to Extreme International. As well as the UK, recent engagements have been in the Middle East, South Korea, and Vietnam. I should say before we start that anything we say was based on information at 9:33 a.m. and we can't be held responsible for any government announcements that happen over the next hour. As you will imagine, when we had our pre-discussion about this webinar a couple of days ago, we weren't expecting some of the changes that have been made, but we will endeavour to do our best to get through them and consider their impact. So without further ado, let's kickstart the discussion. I'm going to ask Philip, before we go into today, just to go back a week or two to a time when we were aware that coronavirus was becoming a bigger issue in terms of spread, but obviously we'd had a lockdown, we'd had businesses having time to prepare and start to adapt to the world around them. And what was your experience of how the hospitality and leisure industry were getting there in terms of changing the way they do things?
Yeah, I mean, probably when we even thought of planning this, Simon, and great to be on again. And of course, since we planned this, our agenda for the call has kind of moved at a great pace, because we first thought we were going to talk about how a business is going to cope without the furlough scheme, which was due to end at the end of October. But it's fair to say that just coming in, going through the summer, there was quite a lot of positive news, actually, as people really adapted. Social distancing was ingrained and people got adapted to it. Many of the, certainly in the sort of pub world, adapted well to that. And the Eat Out to Help Out scheme was a huge success. And just some stats that, the sales in August were kind of 80% across the sort of whole F&B sector of those in January, but that was with only 75% capacity, and reservations at restaurants peaked at over 200% growth year on year. So it really did provide a big impetus, which I guess sadly, as soon as that impetus was there, we ended up then coming into the second wave and the tier 2s and tier 3s, and tier 3 and curfew in particular had a big impact on much of the trade, and a probably slightly unfortunate impact, because I don't expect it changed people's social habits that much. They just took their fun elsewhere. Likewise, the hotel world was kind of a tale of, I wouldn't say tale of two cities, but it was London and the rest. So London was hit really badly and never really picked up during the sort of freeze from lockdown and before London went into tier 2. And that's principally because of the lack of international travel, city centres being pretty much empty as most of the workforces work from home. The regional story was a lot better relatively. I mean, it was a horrible story all round, but the regional story was a lot better in that the staycation market was great, and there's some real hot spots around the country where hotels kind of outperformed actually what they might have expected in normal years. But the hotel sector stat, which the firm I used to work for, who won't be mentioned, produced this figure the other day, which I thought was extraordinary, because it basically said that the fall in RevPAR, which is revenue per available room, so it's a mixture of occupancy and what you're charging for a room, the fall in 2020 is in aggregate greater than every fall that has happened in every bad year that's happened since 1979. So 9/11, the financial crisis, the London bombings, all those things that had a big impact on the hotel market for a period, all those declines added together still aren't as bad as what we faced in this year. So it's been it has been a big shock to the sector, despite that many have been able to sort of adapt their offering, to I guess key workers initially was quite a filled up, certainly many hotels filled up rooms, but it has been very hard. And of course, the other area that I guess cinema and theatre that I'm being familiar with, well, theatres have just had to be closed, and the real tragedy for them is that many began to open up and plan to open. Many were in receipt of the Culture Fund grants to enable them to sort of put on productions, and they've just all had to close again. And once you've committed to open, it's very expensive, because you've built your set, you've paid for the actors, you've done the rehearsals. So so it's I don't know, it's clearly everything's now shut, and then everyone.
Yeah. And we in our last webinar, I think we were optimism is difficult to achieve at the moment, but we were talking about the gradual coming out from lockdown. We were pre the tier changes, and one of the points that we discussed briefly was this issue from my side. Was the question to you was, how was a restaurant able to operate, to have confidence if there was a hotspot in that restaurant and actually there was an order to close? At the time, what we weren't envisaging was a second full lockdown. And back to the point you just raised, this issue of the capex requirement to open. I've certainly come across a number of businesses that have either recently opened or been open for 2 or 3 months now, having invested in order to do that and to make their premises fit for new purpose. And now it seems to me that not only are they faced with the issue of the current lockdown having to close again and now find more money to open up, but also the threat, of course, that we might have a third lockdown in January, we might have a fourth lockdown in March or April, because what winter aside for a moment, apart from the challenges of not being able to use outdoor space, there does appear to be this natural movement of people towards going from lockdown to starting business as usual, and I don't mean that from the trade point of view, but from the punter point of view. People get back to starting a normal pattern, save for wearing a mask and hopefully keeping a bit of social distancing. So the adaptations that have been made for businesses, for restaurants now, what challenges do they face in terms of being able to sustain those changes for a period of time, whether that be 6, 9, 12, 18 months?
Well, many adapted, and a lot of innovation came through. So, and I guess it's very particular to what type of restaurant or where you were located. Clearly, during the summer and the early autumn, if you had outdoor space, brilliant. And many would have put in pizza ovens or some kind of more takeaway or fast food option. Also brilliant, because actually those and some of the pubs I know have ended up making more money in the summer than they might have made, because a pizza is kind of 90% gross margin and you were pumping them out. And many of those have adapted, and I think this is the issue you pointed, by putting in marquees. And I know just in my local village, the pub actually been very popular. It's very tight inside, so he's invested in a marquee. He reckons he had an 8-week payback period. He's in week 3 and now he's closed. That's, and I suppose what that does next time round, and for those who didn't do it this time round, is you begin to lose the confidence to do it again. And as you said, you kind of feel that the government don't want to lock down, really, and you kind of hope that we cannot ever do a third one. But then they said 2 weeks ago we'll never have a second one. The tier system was going to be the way. I think most of the pubs have worked out, or restaurants, the social distancing. They've kind of adapted really well, actually. And for many of the people I talk to, it hasn't really reduced the capacity. They've either got people in earlier and out quicker. They've simplified menus so you can speed the route to the kitchen. Literally there were challenges because you had to social distance in the kitchen, but they have adapted, and that hasn't been so much the problem. It is the fact that if you can't operate at all. Of course, many have embraced online orders and delivery, and that area has year on year has grown over 25%. So if you hadn't embraced that, you really need to have found a platform that you could get involved in online delivery. But I suppose I fear for many that the confidence of investing, again, our local pub, we're saying, well, we'll see you at Christmas and we'll be here for our sort of, Christmas Eve's, pub crawl around the village. And he said, no, I don't think I'm going to be open because I just can't risk doing it and then closing within a few weeks. So it is very fragile.
Yeah, I mean, hindsight is 2020, isn't it? We discussed last time potential issues for the future, the potential interruptions for business. But actually, I found myself advising businesses where they've incurred debt, they've had a business model, they have adapted that business model, and to an extent been relatively successful, whether that be a pub that obviously is relied on customers coming in, has moved to a takeaway model for decent standard food, but has then geared up to become the hybrid again, and left behind that kind of that lockdown business model, and now find themselves faced with either going back to where they were, or now at least having to plan for a much more hybrid adaptation of what the world looks like. If you've had some success in that delivery model, then presumably, arguably, you want to keep that infrastructure in place, as well as try and be prepared for a return to some form of normality.
I totally agree. And one of the sort of, I guess, potential advantages or potential changes that have happened now is that clearly the furlough scheme has come back in immediately, and it was as generous as the previous scheme was. And now, as we heard today or yesterday, they extended until March. So that gives, that's great news for many institutions. I think apply this time round, though, you can be flexible, so you can have your staff working part-time, whereas before it was kind of furlough or not furlough. And appreciate in the restaurant pub trade there's a lot of 0-hour contracts, so you had quite a bit of flexibility anyway. But I think the fact that you can now sort of downsize your business, I suppose, and for some to maybe only operating a few days a week, or have something that is much more flexible model, probably helps. Whereas it was hard last time, because if you put somebody on furlough, they couldn't work, and that was when you actually might have just wanted them to work a bit. I don't think the challenges of now that they've learned the lesson now, Simon, because the biggest problem, and this is in all the institutions I've been involved with, is working out just what would work in what was a COVID-19 secure zone. And there was a lot of uncertainty to start with, and there was a lot of trial and error from many businesses. Now they've worked it out, and so I think the ability to sort of get back into action quickly is, I think they could get back in. I think they could get back in fast. It would only be if they needed, and those who've made investments probably want to get back in fast, so they get some return on those investments. But otherwise, I think fundamentally everything on the sort of variable cost side is fine. It's a fixed cost element, which is obviously rent and rates, that is the other challenge, which we'll talk about.
Yes, and yes, you've read my mind. I mean, we discussed briefly coming into this the issue of the creditor position and the issue of landlords specifically, and just dealing with the general creditor position first. We're now starting to see that businesses which have tried their best to weather the storm are now finding challenging situations from not their landlords, but also their suppliers, where actually there was obviously a hope early on that this was a temporary issue, that debtors would be slow for a while, but people would be able to get back to a level of normality. But what's happened is that you've got a level of accrued debts, and now businesses, understandably across the country, which require their own cash flow, their own debtors to be paid in order to be able to continue trading. So there is one of the knock-on effects of a delay to any normality has been this accruing of debt on a balance sheet, but also different types of debt. And of course, government legislation to date has focused both on clearly protecting employees, but also protecting businesses really only from landlords and the rent accruals for a post-COVID period. Now, as matters stand, the prohibition on landlords is to the end of December, and it took a while after the government announced that they were going to amend the legislation for them to actually amend the legislation with regard to winding up petitions and protecting companies from actually receiving winding up petitions on unpaid rents. I'm aware of cases at the moment where landlords are taking businesses through the court to get the judgment to be ready for when the prohibition is lifted. And clearly there is now a disconnect between the job retention scheme and the landlord protections from claims against companies. My own view, firstly, is that I think there's going to have to be a further extension of that legislation to protect businesses, because I don't really see how you can justify businesses requiring a job retention scheme whilst then saying, but landlords are free to go and do what they couldn't do during the last period. But secondly, also, I think this becomes a much broader issue now. Accruing rent for 3-6 months is one thing, but the chances are that by the time businesses have a realistic return to normality, any form of normality, for a number of businesses, they will have accrued 9, 12, possibly 15 months rent. And I question whether now the government has to think about legislation which actually puts a longer term moratorium on that intervening period, as long as businesses going forwards meet their rental obligations. And that's, of course, more skewed towards those landlords and tenants where deals just haven't been done. Landlords are not willing to do deals, or they just simply haven't met eye to eye on their commercial negotiations. Because otherwise, it seems to me, as soon as that prohibition on landlords is lifted, there is going to be a huge amount of businesses facing challenges from their landlords.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I suppose from what we've experienced so far, many landlords, I'm just mainly thinking about the restaurant sector at the minute, but many have, and probably over 50% have recognised that the two things probably. One is that if you're a fundamentally good business before the lockdown started, then you're banking on that being a good business when we come out of it, and have been more flexible, I suppose, in agreeing rent holidays, or however you might call it, and restructuring how you might go forward. Whether that was enough, because I don't suppose anybody really planned to go into another lockdown when all those plans were done. So maybe there's a further discussion to be had. There's a number, about 25% again, and we would say from our experience, still thinking about it, recognize there's still negotiations, and some are just hanging on for the moratorium to end. And I suppose if you're a landlord, you've just got to kind of think, well, what else is going to go in here right now? Because there's nobody actually banging on the door for new premises. It's whereas before you might have considered that some businesses were just badly performing, they'd done their time, and this particularly in restaurants where there's sometimes a bit of a shelf life for some, then that you've got that you can take the premises and somebody with a better concept will come in. I just don't think that's the case now. And in some cases where and let's talk about London city centre, you're kind of in a scenario where whatever comes back is going to be very, very different for many, many years to what it was before, because it'll take a long time for the workforces, if ever, to be the same size as they were before. So I think if nothing else, you're right, Simon. There needs now it's inconsistent right now between that moratorium ending soon and now the furlough and everything else coming through. I suspect that they will be looking at this. I can't believe they wouldn't be, and it's got to be extended. There will be landlords who will be very bitter about this because they've probably been taken advantage of, and in all these sort of blanket schemes, there will be ones that have sort of they need that premises back, and they could do something else with it. They could convert it into housing or whatever it might be. So I know there'll be a lot of frustration as well.
Yeah, and I think on your numbers, my experience, probably broad brush, is that if you can't renegotiate with 20% of your landlords, if you simply can't achieve that position, then I think that puts huge uncertainty over the viability of the business as a whole, because the level of overhead that you're incurring there versus the likely profitability on those types of businesses at the moment means that there will be huge uncertainty. But I mean, linked with that uncertainty is confidence. And going back to the point regarding London, I've restructured businesses where I've now restructured businesses where they have only failed due to COVID-19. They were profitable businesses beforehand in the restaurant sector, but because of the lack of confidence in the market, because of the uncertainty, they have gone from businesses which were attractive even with COVID-19 to no one being able to get to a number that made it worth going through an expensive restructuring exercise. And that fundamentally is the challenge. And I think there are probably a number of lawyers on this listening to this webinar, and the challenge, I think, for every one of you is to think about, especially those who are insolvency or property based, is to think about how legislation may be brought that would put some kind of longer term protection against landlords bringing claims for COVID period rents, as long as businesses were able, after a certain time, to pay their rents as and when they fall due. And where that doesn't happen, clearly landlords should be given powers to recover. I have a huge amount of sympathy for landlords in all of this, but I also have a huge amount of sympathy for the businesses that occupy the premises, because this wasn't anyone's doing. We are here a result of, third extraordinary circumstances, and for everybody, sensible solutions need to be thought about as to how we navigate our way out of this. So moving on to the hotel sector.
Yeah.
And back to your point on RevPAR, one of the questions we were asked leading into the webinar was banks and their confidence in the sector, their willingness to lend. Given those what I would say are relatively frightening stats with regard to the drop in revenue per available room, and the likely recovery of those numbers taking until 2024. Where do you think the hotel sector is at the moment?
So let's say that the bounce back forecast in 2021 is pretty steep as well. However, there are sort of the scenarios do assume a vaccine towards the end of the second quarter, which, I'm not sure. Do you know what? I expect that there's going to be quite a reduction in rooms in capacity. I wouldn't be surprised if out of this that we'll lose 25% of available capacity today. So capacity's been growing really steadily. What has certainly happened this year, that any forecasts about new supply coming on stream, they've all been mothballed. So supply was beginning to outstrip demand in previous years. And I suspect that where that will hit most is in the independent hotel sector and some of the city centre properties in London, elsewhere, because they just won't have the footfall to justify it. I suspect if you're in some of these small hotels or some of these hotels in London, you could quite easily turn into a residential property at some point, but maybe that's also, there's so many offices. So, I suspect if you're a lender there, you would just be looking at alternative use. I think in the regional ones, 2021 more than likely is going to be another big staycation year. So all the sort of holiday letting companies would say that their bookings for 2021, until the lockdown started again, were probably up 20-30% on previous years. So people have really sort of planned going into 2021 to stay in the country, and I guess anybody booking a holiday realizes that now it's a pretty uncertain thing to do. You mentioned the forecast is getting back to where we were in 2019 is going to be in 2024. You cannot be going forward with the same model that you might have had in 2019. So, it's quite possible that you would significantly restructure your operations. And I suppose what we've been talking about in many hotels is, rather than the normal sort of cost-cutting measures that you might take, is to say, well, we take a few people out of the kitchen, a few people off the front desk, etc., etc. You've really actually just got a zero-based budget this stuff. We're now a hotel that effectively, if it's a 300-room hotel, let's assume we're a 150-room hotel. What's the scale of business that we need to? That's the scale of staff, etc., that we need to run that business. You have much simpler operations. A lot of people hold out that digital and technology, this is going to, this is where hotels, which are traditionally being a bit behind in adapting to new tech. I personally, I don't buy that. I do buy that there needs to be more technology. I don't buy that it's a savior, because these things take time to put in place. They take time for staff to change and to learn. There's a cultural adaptation that's required. So I think there's lots of things you can do to be more efficient, but I think it's a fundamental cost, and that many of that is in your human capital that you've got to focus on. The question on lenders is again the same as general believing. There's a sort of support to keep belief that the sector is a long-term viable sector. It has always historically recovered from these big hits and then continue to grow. So it's seen as being a good asset class generally. There was support, for travel lodges, CVA, in terms of from the lending side to support that. So I'm not personally so concerned about the banks of good located properties in, I think it's a smaller, maybe less grand, small businesses that might struggle going forward, because they're the ones who probably lose the capacity first.
Yeah, I mean, I won't kind of steal my own thunder in terms of just, I suppose, some practical advice at the end of this in terms of management of businesses. But it strikes me that historically, certainly in the good times, you have had businesses that have made money despite their management. We are now in a situation where I think there will be a lot more focus on the quality of management of a business, the quality of management information, not the accuracy of forecasting, but the assumptions of forecasting, and a recognition that in order to predict for the future, as I think, as you say absolutely rightly, you need to take what you have and assume a completely different outlook. Take a 300-room hotel and now work on how you cut your cloth if only 150 rooms are occupied. And I think there will be a lot more reliance, and there should be a lot more reliance on lenders looking at management and saying, if we put our money with this team, do we trust that they know what they're doing to manage this business properly? Because no one in this environment can put their hand up and say, my forecast is right. I know with confidence that this is going to deliver what I say it's going to deliver, because no one knows where we'll be come December, come March, come June. And when you look at the constant headlines on vaccines, test and trace, the efficacy of these systems, then there is a risk that we will be here for some time to come, and that may well be that we're still having these discussions in the back end of 2021. So forecasting is for everybody extremely difficult, but making sure that you understand the assumptions that you're putting in and why you're putting them in, and having those multiple forecasts, I think will make a difference to a bank, a lender being willing to lend money to what was a reasonable business with a sensible expectation that they will be able to meet the requirements of that loan.
Yeah.
So moving on from hotels then. Moving on to just briefly to cinemas. It's difficult to be optimistic, isn't it? I think the new James Bond film was going to be a huge boost for the industry, and that of course has been delayed.
Yeah, if I had a fear for cinema, but then people would have said in the 80s that cinema was gone because the growth of television, etc., and when Sky and everybody launched. But I do fear that we've seen a bit of a structural shift because we were kind of seeing beforehand, but has been accelerated by COVID and people not being able to go there, principally because of the power of the other of Netflix, Amazon, Disney owned Hulu, Apple. These are major platforms who are using film as a kind of launch pad for their own live streaming. And the more that they believe that they're going to put that into live streaming and maybe just use the cinema as a bit of a flagship to so they can get in the award seasons and all that kind of stuff, the less interesting it becomes for people to go to the cinema. And I imagine the big blockbusters, the James Bonds and the the sort of the Marvel type films, which was already moving in that direction. It was these big films that had to be shown on the big screen, and therefore became a bit generic to some extent. But it is interesting whether people have just got out of the habit of going to the cinema and will find other things to do, and have now just accepted and are more interested in downloading the most recent films and watching them, on the big screen at home or in some other environment. I don't know, but it's very they've been hit. They've hit a bit like retail and other things by a trend that was already happening, and it's kind of just accelerated and brought it forward by maybe 3 or 4 years. And I just don't think it's going to be quite the same afterwards once they can be allowed back into business.
No, and I think in the Bonnie household, the film at the weekend was the release of The Witches.
Yeah,
and obviously they effectively, I think they released it. I don't know whether it was released in cinemas elsewhere, but it was released very quickly onto a streaming platform with a premium price to download it and view it. And as my wife pointed out to me, whilst I thought it was expensive because I'm mean, and it was more than, I remember renting a video cost in 1984, it was cheaper than going to the cinema. And I think you're right, there's going to be that shift. There is a nostalgia for a lot of us in the cinema. There is absolutely a platform for watching blockbusters, but there is also a huge movement of technology and a huge change in people's psyche that actually, when they want to watch something, they want to watch it now. They put it on a screen and away they go. And certainly for the younger generation, the concept of waiting for a specific time and having to be in a specific place to watch something, I think is a slightly archaic concept. So it will be interesting to see how the industry develops. I am a huge fan of cinema, and I do hope that it can adapt. But I think it's extremely challenging at the moment to see the easy route to navigate what may be another 12 months of turmoil and interruption to that industry.
Yeah, and it was adapting and many, trying to find new concept, and the ones that were, because the other factor was affecting cinema was the other element of television, which was these very high quality mini series like The Crown and all which were run to what would historically been cinema quality, and so many cinemas have considered, I guess, broadening their entertainment value, for want of a better word. So you've got, clearly in the last few years, you've got bigger seats, you've got more reclining seats. Now you're going to be able to have food and drink to eat, and all these things are just making it much more of a, not going out to see a film with a bit of popcorn, but a whole, I guess, bit broader entertainment, eating and dining experience. And maybe that will be the angle that will keep it going in a different form going forward. But I do fear that the scale of these companies investing in film, they control the release windows, which for Netflix is 24 hours sometimes, if at all. And Disney, now they have a hugely successful streaming platform, they'll play whatever channel works best, and it may not always be a cinema release.
We have had a couple of questions, Philip, and I'm afraid they probably play more to my strength than yours.
I was hoping that you weren't expecting me to answer the first one.
There's a question on directors' personal liability and also the corporate restructuring plan. I will deal with that. We've gone. Darcy, go back a step. I'm not going to move on quite yet, but I will deal with that at the end. But before we go there, sports and leisure has obviously been hard hit, and I suppose very much beyond the high end of premium sport, the football, and the huge television rights that generates. there is a significant amount of turmoil in the sports and leisure industry, and live events, grassroots sports have all been hugely affected by both the last few months, but also the impact of a second lockdown.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. Premier League, Formula One, these kind of ones which have high television revenue, they're fine, you know, and probably the leagues below that will just have to cut their cloth accordingly. It's hard to get too. You feel for the staff who run these organize, you know, the ground staff and everybody all behind the scenes, and they're clearly now can take the benefit of being back on furlough, benefit such that it is. I think for some of these clubs, it's you know, there's a recognition that they're just possibly paying too much to their, you know, it's hard to feel sorry for a business that's paying somebody £5,000 a week or whatever, if you know, even in those lower leagues. Now, quite how clearly they're on contracts, so their challenge is that those contracts were never made flexible enough to adapt to this current environment. Rugby is the same a bit. It's sort of it's kind of designed for a professional world without being big enough to support some of the things that you know, most rugby clubs have never made a profit, and you know, like anything else, to compete, they spend more on players. You know, obviously, you've heard all the Saracen story. I think with the CVC money and the things coming, there would probably be a better structure around Premier League rugby. But there's a massive tail, and you know, some clubs are having to focus much more on sponsorship. Can they get much more engaged? Anything where you can generate some revenue, as long as you can play, that substitutes for the fact that you won't have attendances. And you know, again, probably the theme of all of this is that in any planning for 2021, you've just got to assume social distancing is there for the year. But you know, whenever a vaccine is going to come out, it's going to go to the elderly first. I mean, the flu vaccine, if you know, which I don't, I'm, you know, in my 50s, and I haven't even been invited for a flu vaccine yet. You know, and that was 6-7 weeks ago when they started the vaccine program. They just don't have enough of it, and so, you know, I can see that it's going to take quite a long time for any vaccine to get to go out properly. So you've got to assume that you're going to be social distancing in whatever stadium you are for quite some time to come. But I think it's, I mean, the key is to be able to play. The key will be able to get some people in, and hopefully you can find sponsors and donors and things like that, something in the community to support. I think the furlough does save many of these from what would have been a cliff edge around about now, because of course you would have all had catering staff and many other people in these clubs. I mean, the other one, Simon, that because it's very close to my heart, is the sort of live theatre side of
yes, and we've just had a question on that around the circumstances when the theatre industry can reopen, level of capacity required to make a production viable, and how this would be impacted by social distancing. So it's a perfect time to deal with it.
Okay, I've gone that far. Well, do you know what? So in Chichester, we've got two theatres. One's 1,300 seats and one's 350. And the 1,300 seat theatre, we were worried that we could only get it to about 400. Actually, we can get about 630 in a social distance in a good way on average. So that's, you know, we've had professionals doing all that, so that's good. The challenge is that, you know, most productions are break even at about, in the old world, in about 70% kind of utilization of occupancy, maybe 70-80%, and of course now we've taken out 50%, and it's. I tell you what, it's the hardest thing is actually to if you're in the arts, is to sort of downscale what you expect. And I guess my message to our theatre is, you're not a 1,300 seat theatre anymore. We're a 600 seat theatre, and so we do things that work for 600 seat theatres. And you know, so where's all the costs? It's in the stage set. So you know, you've just got to make cheaper stage sets, and it hurts because it's not the same quality as you might have been used to doing, but you've just got to do it a lot cheaper. You've probably got to put on much smaller productions. You know, a typical musical might have 50-60 casts. Well, now you've got to run it with 30 or 40. I mean, people have run Shakespeare plays, if you think about it, outdoors, where they've had a cast of 5. You know, and they're still hugely entertaining. Tragically for us, you know, like many theatres, we decided to open. Chichester wasn't just tier 1, so it was fine. And actually, you can still act in theatres even now. But so we launched our first show and closed it yesterday. You know, called Crave, but beyond that, everything, and that was just a 4-person in that play, so it was and a social distance production, so the staff were never always within outside of 2 meters from each other. I think it worked extremely well. But the rest of the production for this year were more cabaret style, so much smaller productions, and what has been very successful in the selling and ticket sales was anything musical. So, you know, one of our evenings was 3 nights with just Sondheim musical numbers being sung by a cast. So not a particular play, but all Sondheim stuff, because I think he's 90 this year, so it's a big year. And that was sold out 200%. So I think we've gained comfort that people would like to come back. Clearly, there's a whole segment of people who are going to be cautious. The social distancing, and that got in the reviews of the play we had, was really well handled, and it was really clear in the theatre. We're blessed; the theatre's quite nice and spacious. The real thing that we're hanging on to that will hopefully work is streaming, both streaming, you know, of historic content, but also live content. And what we've switched into now, with the theatre being closed, is you can still act in the theatre, you can still put on shows, and we were previously, and we're continuing to live stream that. Now, there's a lot to learn about how to stream live theatre, and you know, from a position of this was the devil to do 2 years ago, to realizing this is probably the savior now. The real challenge is getting distribution. You know, so National Theatre are now live streaming their things on their program on Sky Art. Well, brilliant. But what about the rest of the theatres in the country? And you know, we have partnered with a number of other regional theatres, and we both promote each other's shows on each other's membership base. But what we really want to do is get those people in Australia who would like to see, you know, South Pacific or Hound of the Baskervilles or Murder on the Orient Express in a British theatre, but can't come. South Africa, you know, you can think of the rest of the world, and how do we get to them? And that's kind of distribution. And I think there's a lot there's a lot to work on there. And if somebody out there has got the plan and the finances to pull together the Netflix of theatre, that would be brilliant.
Indeed, and thank you for that, Philip. Okay, so dealing with the questions that have come up, and moving slightly more to I suppose directors' responsibilities, management of businesses in the hospitality and leisure sector from here. The first question that's come up is around directors' personal liability and wrongful trading. And I think it moves into the wider issue, which is one of how is a director expected in this environment, in this economy, to run a business? What are the changes, if any, to the legal expectations of their ability to act reasonably? And one of the premises of this question is whether wrongful trading will be extended past the moratorium that expired on the 30th of September. Personally, I haven't heard anything to suggest it will be, but I'm not sure politically or policy-wise it would be sensible to do so, because I'm not sure of the message it sends out. I mean, wrongful trading as a concept, and for anybody that doesn't know what it means, it essentially means continuing to trade your business where you ought reasonably to have known that it couldn't avoid going into liquidation. It's not a straightforward concept, and it's not something that gets brought up very often. There are few cases where directors have been found guilty of wrongful trading, but the relevance of it is that it breaches the corporate veil, and directors can be held personally liable. The issue, going back to what I said earlier, for everybody, for every manager, director of a business is one of being competent in your corporate governance and your forecasting, putting together management forecasts, putting together information which gives you a guide to what you think the future of the business looks like in the short to medium term, but also makes assumptions which are capable of challenge and answer. So that if you are forecasting that your business is going to return to normality come the 2nd of December, then from my point of view, that isn't a reasonable assumption. And so if you can develop that concept of reasonableness into the sense that you are making assumptions, you are challenging them, and you have sensible answers as at today as why they are reasonable assumptions to make, then wrongful trading is not and should not be a material issue. The question for me becomes how many directors do that versus either don't have the capacity to do that or simply choose to bury their head in the sand. And for anybody out there who's advising or considering lending or anything of that kind, the question becomes about challenging people. And I have been through a number of meetings with boards where I'm challenging them on assumptions, effectively playing devil's advocate and saying, but why? Why are we forecasting revenue is going to go from X to X plus 10% in 3 months' time? And either they've got good answers, reasonable answers, or they don't. And if they don't, then I'll continue to challenge. I think advice, and I would say this being an insolvency practitioner, but I think most businesses should be taking advice, certainly from lawyers and accountants, if not from insolvency practitioners, and not necessarily on a paid basis. I spend a lot of time giving advice on a free basis for an hour to test some the assumptions of a forecast or talk through issues with a director. But actually, it's that advice and the minutes of those discussions that are going to help people to be able to have confidence that they're undertaking the right steps now to protect themselves personally as directors, to make sure they're not falling foul of regulations, and also to have the confidence that however bleak the picture looks, that they're getting advice on when they should be taking further steps if they need to. And so, for example, probably one of the words I've used more in the last 30 days than I have in the last 3 years is milestones. You know, at what stage do you look at your business and say, actually, we made assumptions there and they haven't worked. That milestone hasn't been passed, so how do we amend our forecasts accordingly? The corporate restructuring plan it has been the second question. Do I think it will be useful for restructuring within the sector? And the answer is, in relatively narrow terms, yes. But I don't think in a wider proposition it will be. In terms of the moratorium side, I think it will be useful where companies have a viable prospect of achieving a CVA, but don't have the time to do that before there is a risk of creditor pressure that could derail that strategy. Or also, if you think about it, potentially in businesses which have longer term balance sheet solvency, but short-term cash flow issues, where actually if they're given time and breathing space, they will be able to sell assets or undertake strategies that will ultimately pay off their creditors. But for the majority, I think the legislation doesn't do what perhaps some hoped it would do. The corporate restructuring plan side, that specific restructuring plan may be useful for very large businesses. I'm not convinced it will do a great deal for the SME market where most of us operate. We don't have any further questions, and conscious of time being 10:26, it may well be a good time now to just bring you up to date with what we're doing on a wider on a wider program in terms of building financial fortitude. First of all, though, thank you so much to all of those of you who have joined us for this webinar. As mentioned, do take a look at our new Building Financial Fortitude program. The details of that can be found on the slide in front of you, but also on our website at www.quantuma.com/fortitude. We really do hope that you found the webinar useful, and there were ideas and comments, especially no doubt from Philip, which you can take forwards in whatever you do. And please do join us on Wednesday, the 18th of November for the next webinar, where we'll be discussing what a recovery from the pandemic looks like for the UK economy. For that webinar, we'll be joined by financial journalist James Ashton, and also we'll have an external economist. Again, details of that webinar can be found on the slide below and on our website. If there are any questions that haven't been asked yet, or that we didn't have time to answer, we will be sure to follow up, and do please email if you've got any specific questions on anything we've discussed, and we'll endeavour to get those answered and sent back to you. And lastly, and most importantly, thank you very much to Philip for taking time out of your day to share your knowledge, expertise and experiences on the subject of hospitality and leisure. It is a vast subject, and with an ever-changing legal framework, it's a challenge to get it right on a specific day, but your insight, Philip, has been invaluable in understanding quite where we are and where we might be going.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be on. Thank you.
Not at all. And for the rest of you, please have a good day, everyone, and stay safe. Thank you very much.